This week, Christopher Nolan takes over on behalf of all comic book fans everywhere and starts it all over again with Batman Begins.
Tell us, Mr. Wayne. What do you fear?
How do you know my name?
The world is too small for someone like Bruce Wayne to disappear.
Your parents' death was not your fault.
My parents deserve justice.
I cannot let that pass.
If you make yourself more than just a man, then you become something else entirely.
Which is?
A legend.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review. So just help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at The Real World are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in two ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. Brian, last week we put Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which was a Batman origin story, into the Superhero Pantheon. This week we are taking a look at another origin story, and way back in 2005, how young and naive we were to think that this would be the start of kind of a universe, but as it turns out, this was really just the start of Christopher Nolan's decade-long run as pretty much being the best filmmaker going in Hollywood.
Yeah, I was not ready for this movie because, I completely forgot that it was coming out. I'd heard rumblings about a new Batman movie, and to me, it was just great, another Batman movie, and I'm just not going to be excited for it because at the time, no one expected how good this movie was going to be. No one thought that taking a superhero movie seriously like this was a thing. Nolan made it a thing, and he took it seriously, and he took the mythology seriously, and he just did it right. And the fact that he grounded it and made it so realistic, I think that helps it. And he took away all the hokey bullshit and just made it serious. And sometimes you need to make things a little serious to make it better. And man, he did a hell of a job here. And I remember, as I mentioned last week's podcast, being in the theater for Episode 3, Star Wars Episode 3, seeing that trailer, and then just the whole crowd going nuts. And I'm like, what is going on? A Batman movie and people are cheering? I thought Batman wasn't even cool at that point. You know what I mean? Because those movies were so bad. And then all of a sudden this movie comes out. And then what's cool was that it was a month before, I think, it even came out. And I was like, wow, they're promoting this so quick, a month ahead of time. Because it came out in June of '05. I think, Episode 3 was May of '05. So the fact that they started promoting it really hard then, a month before, I thought that was really odd, too, because I just didn't see it coming.
Yeah, I think this movie kind of snuck up on people. I think people were very gun-shy about even enjoying these movies because the fact of the matter is the Batman and Robin was not well received, and in the ensuing 8 years, there was a lot of chaos. There were a number of directors thrown around, there were a number of actors thrown around, and ultimately, Christopher Nolan is the person that was chosen, and I think there were a lot of people that were surprised by this decision, but I think anybody who has watched the movie Memento knows that Christopher Nolan is a fantastic storyteller, especially from a technical aspect. I certainly think there are flaws in his writing style, especially when it comes to writing female characters, but I think from a technical perspective, he is probably one of the best directors in Hollywood history. I mean, you look at any movie that he does, and there are shots in those movies that are some of the best that you'll ever see. I think even in Batman Begins, there's some tremendous shots of the mountains when Bruce Wayne, when we see him, I believe it's Japan, or some of the shots of Gotham in The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, and Inception, from a technical standpoint, is probably one of the best movies of this decade. And I think so much of that has to do with the fact that so many of these movies look like they are CGI, and Christopher Nolan's movies do not look like that. They look very realistic. And even in 2005, when I saw this movie, I definitely remember liking it. I remember being really excited for a sequel because of the ending. I guess it was like a post-credit sequence without being in the post-credits. But I don't remember loving this movie like I have come to love it in the last 14 years or so, because it is still one of my favorite superhero movies, and you can clearly see that this movie is very influential because so many of the superhero movies have decided to go back and do origin stories. We would see that in the first run of Marvel movies. We would even see that with some of the DCEU movies. And the fact of the matter is that it did not necessarily work in some cases, but Batman Begins is probably the origin story to end all origin stories. I don't think it's ever going to get any better than this one because of the care that was put into this. And I can't tell you how impressed I was overall by this movie. Even on a rewatch, I think it still holds up.
Yeah, it's really the writing that's unbelievable because I mean, I took a writing class, my script writing class in college, and this was one of like the examples they used for like the writing structure and like the writing, the script writing structure and the arc and the hero's arc and the hero's journey and everything that they taught about the Batman Begins script is pretty much to a T of what you're taught in writing class. So I don't know if Nolan did that on purpose, but some of the elements are just right on point. The hero's darkest hour, the cave, the elixir, all those little steps. I'm not going to go into detail because it's like a whole class in writing, but the script is just like pinpoint accuracy on how you're supposed to write a script, and I think that's why it's so effective in the writing because it's to a T, to a point where it's like it's kind of coming if you're a writing kind of guy or a writing student or like a writer, but still it's so rewarding because you see like the steps and how everything just kind of falls into place. Like the hero's journey is like a 12-step thing throughout a movie, and this movie just beats everything, and it hits those beats perfectly, and it's a great teaching tool too. And not only that, like I've talked to other, like my friends over the years from different states, and they've also said that they were taught this script in script writing class because it's so like perfect for teaching.
Yeah, and I think that this script is just absolutely incredible, and so much of what makes this movie special is the fact that they went in a completely different direction. And I don't think that Christopher Nolan's vision of what a superhero movie should be what all superhero movies are. You look at the MCU, it's obviously very different from a tone standpoint, even from a look standpoint. It definitely embraces its comic book roots, but I think the argument that I would make is that this movie can stand side by side with the MCU in that they are both very good versions of a superhero story because the focus is actually on the heroes. We don't really get a lot of the villains, especially in this first movie. We get a lot more with the Joker, but our point of view is always with Bruce Wayne, and I think that is extremely helpful because the first four movies, there wasn't a lot of point of view on Batman. There were a lot of distractions, whether it was the villains, whether it was Robin, whether it was whatever. The difference between this particular movie and the first set is that the focus is on this origin story and giving us some background on who Bruce Wayne is. And it's also very different from Batman Mask of the Phantasm. With Mask of the Phantasm, I think there was a sense of tragedy involved with Bruce Wayne becoming Batman because he was leaving this potential life of love to become this hero. And here, it feels like this is Bruce Wayne's destiny, that it is his destiny to become this person, and that he has accepted this as his life. He has accepted the fact that he wants to get justice for the people of Gotham and not do it in the way that Ra's al Ghul is going to do, but he is going to do this for himself and for his city. So, whereas I think Phantasm embraces the tragedy, I think this movie is embracing the nobility.
Yeah, and I'm glad that they take the time to kind of look at his psyche and explore that because we got those glimpses in Forever and then a little tiny bit in like the first Batman in '89, and they really never go back to that. But man, you just kind of like dig deep into his head, and I'm glad they did that because it's kind of like this, psychology breakdown of him and psychological breakdown of him in the first like 30 minutes with those flashbacks, and then going back to the flashbacks and going back to the bats in the cave and embracing his fear and turning his fear against his enemy. It's great. Like, it's everything that I wanted out of a Batman movie that I didn't know I wanted, because I never got all this detail before. I never got to see him become Batman. You know what I mean? It was just him being Batman in '89, and they kind of skipped the first. They basically skipped this part. I'm glad we saw him like figuring out the manufacturing of it all, because it's so fascinating and how he does it, and ordering stuff from China and all these different places around the country to build his suit and to build his artillery. It's great. Like, and the fact that we got a new character in Lucius Fox, where we get this kind of Q type character, like from James Bond. So I'm glad they added that element to it, because it adds this other hip kind of techie thing to it as well, that kind of makes it modern and realistic, and gives you a chance to cast a guy like Morgan Freeman and have a great performance out of him in a small role like that. So just a lot of things they came up with for this movie that were just all hits, and a lot of it kind of is like the blueprint now for like a brand new hero story, an origin story, and everything kind of goes back to this. And everyone up to this point was probably using Superman as kind of their blueprint, but now people go to this, and now everyone has to have the shapeshifter, the guy that turns on you, the mentor figure that teaches you everything and is either going to die or he's going to turn against you and die as well. So it's just all this kind of tropes that kind of came from this as well, that are still being used today in every origin story that's, about superheroes.
Right, and there was a point when there were discussions about possibly bringing Joel Schumacher back. There was also conversations about having Darren Aronofsky perhaps direct a version of Batman that would take us back to year one, which I'm sure would have ended up being at least a little bit similar, but the studio was not happy with what Aronofsky was bringing to the table. And this is the second time that we brought up Aronofsky as a potential director for a superhero project, as there were rumors at one point that he was possibly going to direct Wolverine. I am still very curious to see what a Darren Aronofsky superhero movie would look like, and it's something that I hope we get to see at some point, because I think it would be really fascinating.
Visually, I don't know where he would take it, you know what I mean? But that's just kind of his style, because like you look at Black Swan, it seems very basic, but then the dark stuff gets really, technical and like very cinematic, and the cinematography gets crazy. So he's got that eye for it. Is he going to get weird with it? I don't know, but it depends on the what he's the property, right? So if he does something like a Green Lantern, maybe he can pull it off, but maybe it'll be too weird. I don't know. I don't know if he fits, but just I've read about this. This thing about Darren Aronofsky years ago as well, and I just kept thinking like Requiem for a Dream is like the go-to Aronofsky movie in my head. But then again, you see The Wrestler, so it's like he can do basic stuff as well.
He can do a lot, and I really would love to see what his version would look like. And unfortunately, I don't think we're ever really going to see it. Let's talk about possible casting, as ultimately the role went to Christian Bale, and I think a lot of people were surprised at the time. There is a movie that I always recommend to people. It's called Equilibrium. Brian, have you ever seen Equilibrium?
I watched, I think, most of it, but I thought it was too ridiculous, because it was just felt like a Matrix ripoff. But that's not their fault. But Christian Bale is very, very Neo-like in that movie.
The movie itself is okay. Christian Bale in that movie is amazing. The way that his character is, that is the movie that I would tell people and say that is why Christian Bale should be Bruce Wayne, because he absolutely does a tremendous job, even though it is kind of a Matrix ripoff. That is why. There were a number of other people, including Henry Cavill, Joshua Jackson, Hugh Dancy, Billy Crudup, David Duchovny, Jake Gyllenhaal. All these people were potentially Batman. Even though Christian Bale did win the part, Cillian Murphy, who had also auditioned, was such an impressive audition that he was made Dr. Jonathan Crane, a.k.a. the Scarecrow, and Cillian Murphy has basically been in all of Christopher Nolan's movies ever since then, which is a pretty amusing note to me. Ashton Kutcher was apparently in consideration for this role. Certainly would have been very different. I guess the studio would have preferred him at some point. But Christopher Nolan, thankfully, was not enthusiastic about the idea of casting Kutcher in the role, which prompted Warner Brothers studio heads to drop this idea. I think it would have been more controversial than even Michael Keaton as Batman, and I don't think there would have been near the success. There is no possible scenario where I see Christian Bale, or I'm sorry, Ashton Kutcher being a good Batman.
I want to imagine those one of those. It's like one of those Hollywood rumors that goes around. It's not actually true, but there is some kind of weight to this because there is kind of like some news stories about this, and it's weird because I don't know why they would think that, but that's kind of that Joel Schumacher kind of thinking that Chris Nolan just wanted to eliminate completely, which I'm glad he did.
That is definitely true. One of the other things that's worth noting is when Christian Bale does interviews promoting the movie, he continued using his American accent he had adopted to play Bruce Wayne / Batman. He explained that he didn't want potential moviegoers to be confused about why Batman, an American institution, was being played by a Welshman. And to this day, even 14 years later, I always forget that Christian Bale is Welsh, and every time I hear him using that accent, it always throws me off because he plays an American in so many of his movies, and his accent is so good and so fluid that I barely even notice it at this point. And so, even to this day, you will rarely hear Christian Bale use his regular accent. Something that screenwriter David S. Goyer, who is still prominent in superhero and genre filmmaking, mentioned in an interview that his favorite pre-audition choice for Batman was Jake Gyllenhaal, who only just appeared in his first superhero movie just a couple weeks ago when we talked about Spider-Man. He was ultimately won over by Christian Bale after seeing his test. Jake Gyllenhaal is somebody that has been dancing around these superhero movies, and I think it's interesting that he was finally in one, and it basically seems like it's spoilers for Spider-Man Far From Home. It basically seems like a one and done.
Pretty much, but to be considered either Spider-Man or Batman, that's kind of like this wide range, you know what I mean? But hey, he's got the look for both, but it's just how you play it. But I don't know. I'm still kind of mixed feelings on that performance by Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio, because halfway through that movie, it kind of got a little over the top for me. But we discussed that a couple weeks ago.
Despite this movie's darkness, Christopher Nolan wanted to make the movie appeal to a wide age range. Not the youngest kids, obviously. I think what we've done is probably a bit intense for them, but he certainly didn't want to exclude the sort of 10 to 12-year-olds, because as a kid, I would have loved to have seen a movie like this. And I think this is a good point to bring up the conversation about darkness versus groundedness. Zack Snyder was going for something very dark. When Batman is branding people, the visual look, the saturated colors, that to me is going for darkness. When he is randomly killing people, when Superman is snapping people's necks, that is clear darkness. Yes, there are some dark elements to what Christopher Nolan is doing, obviously, but I think so much of it, very similar to Logan, there's a lot of character-based stuff that I think people confuse darkness with. And I think that's always something that has frustrated me a great deal, is understanding this difference, because there are some humorous moments in all three of the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. I'm going to try to go out of my way to point out some of these humorous moments, but I don't think that this movie is as dark as people want to say it is. And I think a lot of people, when they saw especially The Dark Knight, they took the wrong lessons from it by just making all of their movies dark, as opposed to understanding what Nolan was actually doing. And that, yes, things were a little bit dark, but so much of this was based on the design of it, not having a lot of CGI, being very grounded, being focused on the characters. And that's what I think people tend to get very confused by.
Yeah, especially when they play this movie all the time, like now it is on TV, especially ABC, or whatever it's called now, whatever ABC Family used to be. But yeah, I was kind of shocked because years ago when they started playing it on ABC Family, when it was ABC Family, like I never thought a movie like that would ever be on that channel because it just didn't fit the bill. But when you think about it and the way it plays out, like there's very little profanity used, like it's very family friendly in terms of the dialogue, and it's very simple to follow. Like this is a movie that's much easier to follow as a kid than like Batman Returns, I think. You know what I mean? Because as Batman Returns, like we mentioned, the darkness and being it for adults, this is definitely like for kids as well, like 12-year-olds, like Nolan mentioned. So I think he pulled it off and he found that balance, and it found that right audience, because this is one of those movies that keeps playing over and over on TV and kind of grows and becomes like this thing. Because if you look at the numbers, like this wasn't like a total smash success in terms of box office numbers. It made about, I think, 200 million domestically, but then you compare it to Dark Knight where it made like double that plus some. So it shows you that the movie grew an audience over that 3 years, and over time with DVDs and stuff like that, it's very much a family-friendly movie that kind of gets spread around.
Right, and I think it's pretty amazing to think that this Batman Begins movie did not really make a lot at the box office. It was financially successful, but I think in the era of DVDs, which this was, I think it became even more popular. And by the time The Dark Knight came out, I mean, that movie was a cultural phenomenon, the likes of which I cannot even really compare except with the Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. And even The Dark Knight was so much smaller than those two movies that I don't know if we're ever going to see anything like that for an individualized superhero movie. I guess Black Panther 2 is going to capture some of that.
Yeah, that it was just crazy because you, like I said, analyzing those numbers, it really shows you the importance of like DVD sales at the time and rentals and that kind of thing. And this was like probably the end of the height of Blockbuster's powers and stuff like that. So this was very much a popular rental, and you can't deny like how appealing it is, like on a wide audience too, because the way that Burton made his Batman movies, it feels very like alienating to certain audiences. You know what I mean? But this feels so much wider, and I think that's one of its strengths.
Right. I think we've gone through enough notes. There's so much more that we could talk about with this movie, as there is with all of the Nolan movies. But I do want to get into the categories because I don't want this episode to be 5 hours long. Let's get to the heroes. First, what we have here is another Batman origin story, except it's about exploring the criminal element and trying to salvage Gotham. One of the cliches about filmmaking that you will often hear is New York being a character in the movies that it is featured in. In these three movies, Gotham is very much a character in all three of them. What we have here is Bruce Wayne not being a good person to start off with, but slowly over 10 years we see him grow up. He develops his skills and morality through a series of tests as he explores the criminal element and decides not to join the League of Shadows by talking about and taking the lessons from Rachel Dawes. There is literally a point in this movie when he has a gun and he is ready to murder Carmine Falcone. By the middle of this movie, as we see him develop, we eventually see the fact that yes, Bruce Wayne is going to be this symbol, and that's what they do so well. Is Batman is a symbol because at the very beginning of the movie, he falls down the well, and we see a bunch of bats. So he has a fear of bats. And fear is, of course, another one of the themes that comes up. And I think when you're talking about the thematic elements of this movie, Brian, I think this is why this movie gets taught in screenwriting classes.
Yeah, it's to a T because there's other elements too, like the inmost cave, and then there's literally a cave, and the elixir, and then you got the magic potion that has the fear toxin in it. So it's just like all these little things that were written probably purposely, but for a reason, because that story arc is like a natural story arc that's carried throughout time, and it works, and this kind of amplifies and exemplifies it. So yeah, his journey from the start is just so amazing. In that moment in the car when Rachel slaps him and he's carrying the gun, and he was literally about to kill the guy that killed his parents because he was getting paroled out because he had inside information on Carmine Falcone. And that decision right there kind of just shows you, like, I'd never seen Bruce Wayne, Batman, whatever, just like in that kind of moment being that vulnerable, that, you know, sad, that desperate, that angry, you know what I mean? To actually go that far and go and do the same thing that the guy did to his parents and get this kind of vengeance out. But it was too late because someone went out and did it for him because Carmine put a hit on the guy as soon as he got out of jail and killed him right in public. So that scene right there just shows you like his mentality right from the start. And like he seems broken. Like he seems like a broken person. He wants to, you know, he wants to essentially kind of get away from his family name. So he leaves and he's gone for years trying to learn who he wants to be and what that symbol he wants to be for the people of Gotham and everything like that. So that first 30 minutes is just spectacular because it takes you away from Gotham. It takes you away from the familiarity and kind of brings you in this kind of like foreign world where he's kind of foreign as well. So you see, like you said, through his perspective and kind of see the criminal world from his perspective and learning, feeling apathetic, empathetic, all that kind of stuff. So to me, like his journey is incredible, and the way that Christian Bale is performing in this role is incredible. Like I knew he was talented. Like I knew he was good. Like even like my first Christian Bale movie was actually a Shaft. He was the bad guy in that, but he was so good as an evil son of a bitch in that, and he doesn't get enough credit for that one. But then of course I watched American Psycho afterward, and I can see why. The elements of him being the playboy in that, he's kind of using those same kind of like elements here as Bruce Wayne. I love his portrayal as Bruce Wayne. It's amazing. Like that immediately you can tell he's acting like a completely different person, and that dichotomy, the false face, the false identity, the two faces. And even, in that scene where Roz meets him again in his house before he burns it down, he's just impressed that he's able to make that switch and go to Bruce Wayne and become like a fake drunk in this Playboy and then switch back. It's amazing. It's probably the best. I don't know. It's one of the best I've ever seen. Compared to Christopher Reeves, but the way he just goes back and forth is just tremendous.
Yeah, Christian Bale, it can't be emphasized enough. Just, I think especially in this first movie, I don't think he I don't think he gets as much time in the second and the third movies, but in this first one, I mean, he really has to carry the load in a pretty big way, and the fact that he's able to do that, and consider the quality of actors that he is bouncing off of. Liam Neeson, Morgan Freeman, Michael Caine, and he excels so much. I mean, Gary Oldman, didn't even mention Gary Oldman, but Christian Bale is so good in this role, especially in this first movie, and what he is able to do. I mean, the way that he acts at the beginning, basically acting like an immature brat with the weird hair, and then to see him in the League of Shadows, he just nails every aspect of this. And I'm not even going to save this for the story part because I think this contributes so much to the hero. But one of the things that I love about what Christopher Nolan does is it basically takes us an hour to see Batman for the first time. And what I love about that scene is that it is shot not like an action or superhero movie, but it's shot like a horror movie. And just the way that they introduce Batman, and they don't really, like, you see what he's doing, you see kind of these flash shots, and then you see the big moment when he pulls Falcone out of the limo, and then you see that full costume for the first time. Normally, I'm very critical of not putting the superheroes in their suits, but in this case, the way that they were able to build up to it, and they built up to this moment, and the score is obviously a huge part of this, that is just one of the most exhilarating superhero moments that I think very few movies have ever been able to capture, and Christopher Nolan got it.
Yeah, that scene is so effective because of the way the lighting is. He's great at making these shots based on lighting. I don't know if it's the cinematographer that he always chooses, but the way that he plays with light, especially in Dark Knight. But here it's just like the way that, everything inside the containers are dark and he's pulling people in and you don't see anything still. It's very simple. You know what I mean? You don't have to do a lot of CGI with that. So he's just thinking of simple ways and old school ways to do things. And that's what I love about Nolan. And that's why people compare him to Stanley Kubrick. And I kind of see that comparison where you're just learning how to do new cinema, taking simple stuff and making new ways of shooting it. And he did this effect and it was just tremendous because usually we're just seeing shitty cinematography or fight choreography with I don't know, wacky, choreography. And here it was just simple. We didn't have to see much, and we just saw enough.
All right, let's talk about Rachel Dawes. She's a wet blanket. She's not a character. I'm convinced of this. The fact that they were able to so easily recast this role in the second movie shows me that she's not a character. She is Bruce Wayne's conscience. That is her role. And she is, I call her the disseminator of moral platitudes. And the reason that I'm not giving the heroes a 10 is specifically because I do not think the Rachel Dawes character is written all that well. I'm not particularly a fan of Katie Holmes as a performer, especially in this role. So I have a real hard time with her character in particular. The chemistry with Christian Bale is sort of there, but I watched this movie and Rachel Dawes never does anything for me.
I don't know. I always liked her, and I think I like her more than Maggie Gyllenhaal for some reason. I don't know what it is. I think that she gets the seriousness of it, and then the fact that I think it's just that scene where she slaps Bruce, and you see how much she really cares and how much she's ashamed of him in that kind of moment because she's also a lawyer at the time or becoming a lawyer. So all that kind of stuff happening, and just the tie-in with the family, and yeah, she is the conscience of his head, but at the same time, I think she really brings something to the table, and she's very assertive, and she doesn't stand up, she stands up to her bosses or whatever, doesn't fear Carmine Falcone. She's willing to get in the fight, you know what I mean? She's willing to take the steps and not cave into the corruption. So I thought that was kind of cool of her, but I kind of see your point, but I don't know why. I think I like her better than Maggie.
Yeah, I'll make a final decision next week, and that will probably be one of the burning questions, but I've just never been particularly impressed. Who is impressive is the other characters in this movie. Commissioner Gordon finally gets stuff to do, and Gary Oldman is spectacular in this role. He plays the noble policeman so well. The moment when he is consoling Bruce Wayne after his parents have been murdered, the moment when he refuses to take the money, and the way that he speaks about that, the way that he interacts with Batman. Gary Oldman is, of course, known for playing villains, but the way that he plays Commissioner Gordon, this is probably my favorite iteration of Gary Oldman because of the way that he is able to get across the goodness that is Commissioner Gordon. And I'm so glad that we finally have a good version of this character.
God, I mean, the fact that they casted Gary Oldman too, and just the fact that like he sold it so well, and like he was so good right from the start. And I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's his Ned Flanders mustache that they gave him or what, but just him. He's not he's not even that naive. He's just good, and he wants to be good. And even though his partner is like so corrupt and such a dick and an asshole and taking bribes right in front of him and just telling him like, "Hey, you should take bribes too," and they're just still saying no, and then helping Batman out at the end. All that. I think everything just works up to this big payoff, and I think you get a bigger payoff in Dark Knight with the fake out. But still, like him in this role is tremendous, and I think you're right too. Like it's my favorite Gary Oldman role. Like you think of like how crazy he was in True Romance, or like how wacky he was in The Fifth Element. And I haven't seen the Winston Churchill movie, but just the clips of that, it's very much like very serious, dramatic. Got to put on the fake suit and put on this accent kind of thing. But here he's just kind of being like a good person, you know what I mean? Like that's very hard to translate in a world being this corrupt that they created in Gotham. So it's very awesome to see that he still has this like hope, you know what I mean? And still holding out for that hope. And then when Batman comes, it kind of like, certifies and, rekindles that hope. So I like that connection of the fact that he's willing to help Batman, and the fact that he shot down the bridge at the right time, meaning he's got good aim. I thought that was like a nice little thing they gave him, because without that thing going down at the end, the train would not have crashed, and the plan would have worked probably for Ra's al Ghul.
Certainly not. And when you think of British butlers, Michael Caine is pretty much the embodiment of that. He is the perfect Alfred, and he looks and sounds like an English butler. I mean, that's really the only way to put it. Let's not complicate this any more than it needs to be. And I think my favorite moment is when he and Bruce are on the plane, and Alfred tells Bruce that he has permission to take out the Rolls Royce. And when people talk about these movies being too serious and don't have any humor, I mean, that is a perfect example. Some of the banter between Bruce and Alfred throughout all three of these movies, there's just so many of these fun little moments between them, even though there's obviously a lot of weight attached to it as well.
Yeah, and this is what I was talking about in the 1997 Batman and Robin podcast, where like they had a hints of like great communication and dialogue between Alfred and Bruce Wayne. Here, this is kind of like it, and they kind of use this over the three films, and it's a great relationship, because you never get this relationship building in the other movies. And like this is what you needed, because he needs that mentor role, since Ra's is not there anymore technically, because he was supposed to be that mentor role. But you take him out, he needs another mentor for the rest of the movie, and Alfred's right there, and he's going to be there for all three movies. And Michael Caine is amazing, and I mean he's got this body of work, you know what I mean, that's kind of all over the place. I would say more so, not more so comedy, but probably 50-50. But he's able to balance it so well, you know what I mean, because he's so good at it. And like to me, I think my favorite moment of the movie, or my favorite Alfred moment of this movie, is him just driving the car and just like crying his eyes out, because he knows that Bruce Wayne's in pain, and he's like hallucinating, and he's worried to death that he's going to die in the back of his car.
Yeah, I think that is a tremendous moment in a movie full of them. And speaking of banter, Morgan Freeman playing kind of the Q role as Lucius Fox, the talk about spelunking. I mean, it's just so funny to see Christopher Nolan basically make a James Bond movie within a Batman movie. Nolan has always talked about possibly doing a James Bond. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but you definitely see some of that in this movie when they're talking about some of the gadgets and some of the clothing, and why Batman needs to have a cape, why he needs to have specific armor and whatnot. Just really love the role that Morgan Freeman plays in this movie. And this was kind of the start, kind of the second half of his career, where he's not in a lot of leading roles from this point forward, but he plays a key supporting role, and he was pretty fantastic in this movie.
Yeah, it's so refreshing. And I can't even remember if this was like a new role written for the movie or whatnot, but it's exactly
Lucius Fox is in the comic books.
Okay, because this is something that was totally missing from the original movies that was totally needed. And like it's good to have these moments because it puts the audience in that kind of perspective and you kind of learn things in the same perspective as Batman. How do these things work? And then you add some logic to it and then it adds to a payoff of when the thing actually works at the end of the movie, like the gadget or whatever. So that was like a nice little touch, and that's kind of why some of those Bond movies work because like in the really good Bond movies, like when they tease like a weapon or gadget at the beginning, it kind of pays off at the end when they kind of use it. So I'm glad they kind of use that aspect of it because you have payoffs like that, and it's good to see him learning and becoming that and using all that technology that's been kind of abandoned by Wayne Enterprises in his absence. So that was a nice little touch. And kind of redefining the Tumbler, or not the Tumbler, the Batmobile from the Tumbler. I thought that was a nice little touch as well.
There's so much to talk about with the heroes, and based on all of this, the score that I've come up with is 8. I think this is a Pantheon level group of heroes. I think the only real weakness in my mind is Rachel Dawes. Depending on your feelings, you may even want to go as high as a 9 or 10. Brian, what say you?
I'm gonna go with a 9, almost a 10, but you have your complaints about Rachel Dawes. I just don't feel like it's a complete 10 yet. I think we get that in the next movie, but this is just tremendous acting all around, and it's just, to me, it got better in the second movie.
All right, let's talk about the villains. I don't think either major villain is a full character either, but they're around just enough to come off as a threat, and they are not cartoon characters. Again, you have these credible actors in Cillian Murphy and Liam Neeson, but they are not exaggerating themselves. They are not trying to out-crazy anyone. You have Scarecrow, who is a real doctor and insane, but he doesn't really go over the top. I think there's only really one moment when he's under the mask that he goes a little bit over the top, but I think in that specific situation, I think it works. Ra's al Ghul was allegedly Ken Watanabe, but it turned out to be Liam Neeson playing the role of Ra's al Ghul, and Liam Neeson playing the mentor character. I think he really does some great work with Bruce Wayne throughout this movie. I think my biggest criticism is Tom Wilkinson. He is in a Tim Burton or Joel Schumacher Batman movie with his accent. I do not like Tom Wilkinson in this movie. I love Cillian Murphy and Liam Neeson.
Yeah, it's pretty wacky, but I can't help but enjoy it because Tom Wilkinson will always be, like, I'll always remember him as, like, the bad guy from Rush Hour. And I was like, oh, great, he's playing a bad guy here. That kind of fits. I don't know if, like, they did that on purpose. It's typecasting or whatever, but, yeah, and, because of the accent, he's British, or I think he's British, but it's not a natural, whatever kind of Jersey, New York style accent he was going for. A Gotham accent, I guess you want to call it, but it was a little over the top at times. But I do like the Carmine Falcone character a lot because this was like it felt like the first time that I've seen Batman fighting the mob. And I know we kind of saw that in Mask of the Phantasm, but I'm talking like the live action movies. And this was like 2005. And I hadn't really watched the animated series at that point, maybe a few episodes. But it was really cool to see Batman fighting the mob. You know what I mean? I'd never seen that before. And I'd watched like the first 3 seasons of Sopranos at that point. So I was kind of into that. And my favorite movie is The Godfather. So this idea of Batman and the Mafia coming together really just like enticed me. And I love that aspect of it. Scarecrow, I was kind of disappointed with. Only because I thought like he was gonna have a bigger finale at the end because it seemed like they were building him up a little more, but he was just kind of like this pawn. And I also got confused too because when I first saw this movie, I thought the idea was like Princess Bride instead of like, because I knew Ra's al Ghul was like immortal, right? And they had this Lazarus pit, but that's not something Nolan would do. So I thought instead of a Lazarus pit, it's the idea of a Dread Pirate Roberts where they just kind of hand the name down. And that's what I kind of first interpreted as a beginning, like that was Ra's al Ghul at the beginning, but then as soon as he was killed, Liam Neeson was the only one left, so he took the name of Ra's al Ghul. But I guess it was just he was Ra's al Ghul the whole time. So interpreting it that way, it's kind of interesting, but maybe my way was a little even more interesting because that kind of it does the whole thing about living forever, and he does mention about living forever, being immortal. But if you hand the name down, that kind of makes the name immortal kind of thing, the legacy of it. So I thought that was kind of the interpretation they were going for. It didn't really get to that point, but I felt like Crane was a good little mid piece in the middle of the movie, kind of throw you off, making it seem like he was going to be the main guy. But I do love that interpretation of Scarecrow, where just everyone is scared shitless and like the toxin is flowing freely, and you know what I mean, like, and the idea that he puts on the mask and it kind of like creates this like moving face stuff. I thought it was really creative on Nolan's part to kind of interpret the way he interpreted the Scarecrow character because it's scary as hell, and that's what it needed to be.
I love the fact that the villains feel so much more realistic, and I think there are many ways that you can interpret both of these characters, and I don't think any of them are necessarily incorrect. I really appreciate the fact that, again, this is such a divergence from the previous series in that the Penguin was basically a penguin in the Tim Burton movie, and Catwoman was kind of a cat, and the Riddler and Two-Face were out of their minds, and Mr. Freeze was making puns, and Poison Ivy was an actual plant. But here, I think there's a lot more method to the madness, so to speak, and I think for all those reasons, I think it works out really well. One of Christopher Nolan's favorite movies and a heavy influence on this Batman was the movie Blade Runner, and I guess in the spirit of Blade Runner, Rutger Hauer plays a small role as one of the executives in Wayne Enterprises, and he's just kind of a subtle dick. And I love the fact that they filled out this movie with so many actors like Michael Caine and Morgan Freeman and Rutger Hauer, because I think it really just adds to the credibility, because again, they're not behaving like cartoon characters. If you watch Rutger Hauer in Blade Runner and then you watch him in this movie, it's basically like watching two different people. You may not even be able to identify Rutger Hauer in one or the other, depending on your understanding of him. But I really like his role in this movie as well. Even though he is not technically a villain, he is an antagonist, and I love his role in this movie, and that is one of the reasons that I'm willing to put this score as high as it is. I'm giving this an 8.
I'm going with an 8 as well. I would have gone 9 if like Crane was just like even more villainous, but he just kind of became a pawn at the end. And I think maybe if we had a little more Liam Neeson, it would have been even higher, but they kind of saved that for the big reveal at the end, so I understand that.
Right. I think there is a lack of villain development, and I think they sacrificed that for Bruce Wayne. And I'm willing to give the movie some benefit of the doubt for that, because they were trying to do something that was so different, and I think ultimately so much better. Okay, so one of the other things that we're going to talk about is the story. The plot really doesn't make sense either. The actual machinations, still not totally sold, but I think from a thematic standpoint, it all connects a lot better, if that makes sense. So this is a Batman origin story, but not so much on a practical side. On the one side, Gotham becomes a true character. This is something that is explored throughout the trilogy. The theme of fear is used throughout and best serves to pay off in the finale with the actual fear gas being spread around Gotham and basically trying to turn the city against each other. I love the process scenes. I love this in all movies. We saw this in Iron Man 2 as well. With Bruce training and building his suit, I love the fact that they are ordering 10,000 of different items as opposed to one thing. And not only can they build extra suits, but it just makes sense from a practical standpoint. I love the fact that the first version of the Batman cowl that they get doesn't really work out, that it's too fragile and they have to go and order more. I love those scenes in particular, Brian, and I know you do as well, because you are a huge mark for the suits.
Yeah, and just something about seeing that process, and seeing it pay off, like I said before, where you see like the gadgets paying off later on in the movie and all that kind of thing. And I know like the idea of ordering like in bulk, because at my old job I used to order stuff from China all the time, and you can't just order one thing, because that'd be like a sample and then the cost would be high, and then if you lose that sample, you're fucked. So you got to order in bulk. And looking back now, I was like, oh yeah, I totally get the whole ordering in bulk thing now with the business kind of mindset. But that makes sense as well, because you got to cover your tracks, right? You can't just like order these certain things and it'll be suspicious, because they'll be like, why do you need this like 2 orders of this one thing that looks like a helmet or whatever, you know what I mean? So those little details really pay off. And then him finally, the big reveal you mentioned earlier, just tremendous stuff. And the idea that the toxin brings out his fears is perfect, because that's, Batman's all about conquering his fear, and that's what the whole symbolism is of the bat, right? So I guess the idea of using Crane in that sense made perfect sense, because he was all about the fear gas and whatnot, so that ties in together. And then the idea of conquering your fears right off the bat, because it's an origin story, so you tie that in together, it all makes perfect sense. So everything just made like all this continuity sense, logical sense. And not only that, like the story arc was like perfect by the end, because this is a little side lesson too as well. Like in every single movie, I hate to ruin this, but like every single movie, there's hero's darkest hour. Like 2/3 into the movie, there's the hero reaches this point where it feels like there's no turning back and he can't win. Whatever he's trying to do, whatever he's trying to conquer, he can't win. And that exact moment is built up from the beginning, because when he falls in the cave, he's pulled out by his father, and what does his father say? Why do we fall, Bruce? So we learn to pick ourselves up again, right? It sets it up when the fire happens and the beam falls on him, and Alfred has to help him up. What does Alfred say? Why do we fall, Bruce? And then Bruce says, so we learn to pick ourselves up again. And it's the perfect way to get back up. And because that's the moment where it feels like, oh my God, like the whole house is going to burn around him and he's going to die, right? Hero's darkest hour. He comes right out of that. That signals the end of Act 2. You go into Act 3 right after that. So it's just perfect writing. You know what I mean? And you that's why like all these examples were used in all my writing classes, because it's almost to a T. So my score is going to be a perfect 10 because it's just perfectly written. It's taught in my classes. And like everything is just like hit to a T, and everything's perfect.
I'm going to give the story a 9, even though I'm still not convinced that the actual plot machinations work. But I feel like the script itself, the dialogue, the character interactions, everything just comes off as being so believable that despite itself, I still think it works out. So I am giving the story a 9.
Yeah, I think that might have been the first perfect 10 I've ever given on writing, and it's no surprise looking back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is really outstanding. I'm not sure that it's perfect, but I certainly think that a lot of people talk about The Dark Knight and how great it is, but man, I think this movie just holds up so tremendously well upon rewatch. And even in looking at the technical parts of this, the movie just looks great. I think the editing between the different timelines, this is something that Nolan does all the time. I love the editing. I like the fact that they are not holding the audience's hand at all times and they're kind of expecting you to keep up. And the pacing of this movie is so great. And there are even times when the cuts are maybe a little too fast and maybe it kind of feels a little bit like a Michael Bay movie. If you go on the internet, you will find many people that call Christopher Nolan a smart man's Michael Bay, and I could certainly buy that. I think the colors at times are maybe a little bit too blasé, but there's some great camera work. The visuals are tremendous because the CGI is so seamless, and of course we have to talk about the score because Danny Elfman's Batman score is iconic, so how are you going to follow that up? I don't think it's as hummable or as memorable, but I think the score for this movie is also really, really good, and it's something that only gets improved upon in future sequences. But this is a great, great technical movie, probably one of the strongest of the entire series. I think I would, from a technical standpoint, this is probably as good as you are ever going to see, so I'm giving this a 9.
Yeah, I'm giving it a 9 as well. Almost a perfect 10, but it wasn't quite there. You mentioned the colors. Yeah, towards the third act when they're doing the big thing on the island and like you saw the smoke around and like the mist and stuff. I'm not too big of a fan of like brownish kind of colors, and I saw a lot of that, and I wasn't too much of a fan of that. But the visual stuff of like the bats, like the way that they use the bats is like this powerful tool that like uses the bats as like a weapon at times. I thought that was pretty cool. The visual of him standing on top of the fucking tower on that like that sculptured thing or whatever, that's iconic. Like that's one of the most genius shots of like Batman ever. And it looks so real because it's just him standing there. There's no CGI about it. It's just a stunt. It's a stuntman, obviously, but the idea of that shot, to even pull that shot off, you got to go up in a helicopter and do a wide shot to do that, and you got to circle around the guy, like tremendous. And with the dusk, shot going with the lighting of the sun going down, tremendous. Like that's iconic.
And they actually topped that in The Dark Knight with IMAX cameras.
Yeah, I know. That's what's even more amazing. Like they were so on top of things in terms of like getting the modern visual style down as well, because obviously he wanted, like we weren't at IMAX as a regular thing in 2005, but we were going to get there with The Dark Knight because that was kind of ushering it in. But like you can tell he wanted the kind of that effect. He was going for that, especially like you mentioned those mountains and like the way that they kind of did a low angle shot of him in the water and you just see like that landscape. Tremendous stuff. So I'm going with a 9, almost a full 10, but like the colors are kind of off. But the music to me is getting to a point where it's like so fucking iconic, because I even know some friends that still listen to that Batman, the Hans Zimmer Batman theme, and like use it as like workout music because it gets them going.
Yeah, and if you can believe it, I think our technical scores are both going to be even higher next week, and possibly even the story score as well. Let's talk about the legacy. This is the beginning of one of the best trilogies ever created on film. It turned Christopher Nolan into a huge directing star, as after this movie, it wasn't just The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. The Prestige might be one of the most underrated films of this century. Inception is probably one of my favorite movies of the decade. I know there are some people that have mixed feelings on Interstellar. I still really like Interstellar. Dunkirk, not one of my favorites. I know you're a really big fan of Insomnia. I am not, but you can also add that to Nolan's legacy as well. So that is a huge part of who he is. Jonathan Nolan, who is a part of this, has become an important screenwriter, has developed multiple television shows, Person of Interest for CBS, and Westworld on HBO. Regardless of your feelings on those shows, this movie certainly helped to catapult him. Christian Bale became a huge movie star because of this. You saw the transitioning of Michael Caine and Morgan Freeman into the final act of their careers. This is the best origin story ever made, and a lot of Marvel movies have tried to take their cue from this one. And this also popularized the concept of origin stories and reboots. For all those reasons, my legacy score is a 9.
I think the most important thing that came from this movie is changing the like view that Batman was like this corny, cheesy thing that got ruined in the 90s, right? But this totally changed that view. And it changed that perspective. And now it became cool again to like Batman. You know what I mean? And then over that 3 years when people were watching Batman Begins on TV or DVD or whatever, like people started to like popularize it again. It was kind of like more popularized. And, you know, I remember after that movie came out, I was buying like a bunch of like Dark Knight graphic novels. I bought the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns. I bought that right after that, read that and got inspired by it in high school. You know what I mean? So to me, it changed this whole pop culture view on Batman and made it cool again, and got even cooler in 2008 because of the Joker and Heath Ledger and all that kind of thing. So I'm going with a 9 for all the reasons you mentioned, plus just kind of like most importantly, making Batman cool and popular again. And because it was just really down in the dirt and in the trash for like 7 years because of what happened with Schumacher.
My total score for this is a 43, and yours is?
45, one of my highest scores ever.
This is an 88, which means this is one of the highest scored movies ever, and we are putting Batman Begins, our second consecutive Batman movie, being put into the superhero pantheon. We will try to make it three in a row with The Dark Knight, a very underrated movie from what I understand, Brian.
Yeah, so underrated because it wasn't even nominated for Best Picture, and it's not even the most. I mean, everyone remembers Slumdog Millionaire, right? Because that was the most memorable movie of 2008.
It certainly was the case. We will re-adjudicate the Best Picture race next week. But before we get to that, let's get to the burning questions. Is this the best superhero origin story ever? I think the only movie that is even in the ballpark is Iron Man, and I don't think that movie, even though it is also in the Pantheon, I don't think this holds a candle. I think this is by far the best superhero origin story ever told, and it's almost for this reason that I don't think anybody else should even attempt to tell the origin.
Yeah, totally. 100%. Number 2 would be Iron Man. Well, depending on the day, maybe like Superman 78 would be number 2, Iron Man 3, but that kind of depends on my mood. But I totally get it, and you're right, and nothing more will top it. But forever, I mean, they're going to be using this template because that's no matter what, you need to do an origin story, especially for like a character that no one's really familiar with. Like, would you count Guardians of the Galaxy? I'm not sure, but that might be a different kind of dynamic anyway.
Were Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul the right villain choices?
Yeah, because the whole idea, especially like I mentioned with Jonathan Crane and the Scarecrow, is using fear. And the theme of fear was very prominent in the beginning of this movie, and it's used heavily. And it ties in with the whole Ra's al Ghul thing. So everything in that respect was perfect because it made sense. And that idea of fear and the toxin and everything just was perfect.
I think it's important to have these villains because they are not exactly the quote-unquote A squad of Rogues Gallery. Batman has the best Rogues Gallery of any superhero going, but Ra's al Ghul and Scarecrow are definitely towards the bottom of that list, And by using these two villains, they were ultimately able to focus on Batman more, and they were also able to not bring immediate comparisons to previous actors. If they put the Joker in this movie, then you get immediate comparisons to Jack Nicholson. Ultimately, you're going to get that anyway, but in this movie, Christopher Nolan gets to establish himself a little bit. He gets to find his voice and focus on Batman, and that's why I think these two were the right choices. What movie is Tom Wilkinson acting in?
I'm gonna call it the unofficial lost sequel, Rush Hour 3, where he plays his own twin brother from, I don't know, New Jersey or something. And yeah, that's kind of because like I said, Tom Wilkinson will always just be the bad guy from Rush Hour to me. And what other random movie am I thinking of that he's in? I think one with like Marissa Tomei or something like that.
He's definitely much more of a character actor, and you could definitely tell that by his performance in this movie. Is Batman a murderer, since they make such a big deal about him not murdering people, but then he kind of lets Ra's al Ghul die, I guess. So is he a murderer?
No, he's not a murderer. He just Ra's al Ghul pretty much put himself in a situation where he was going to die, and Batman chose just to not grab him at the nick of time. And that's not murder. That's just not caring.
And it is worth pointing out that Batman did save Ra's al Ghul earlier on, and I think that those shots kind of mirrored each other. And it's funny, like, we haven't even talked about, that is probably one of the best shots of the movie, with them sliding down the ice, and just before they get to the cliff, Bruce puts the arm, stabs the ground with his arm, and that's probably one of the best scenes in the entire movie that we haven't even discussed, which probably says a lot. And they also give purpose to him actually having those spikes on his arms, something that no other Batman movie has really ever done.
Yeah, and I was worried that they were going to show him breaking his arm because, God, that must have been so much weight, and you can kind of tell that he was exemplifying that by like the struggle on his face. I was almost worried that they were going to show him breaking his arm right in front of us.
Yeah, that would have been nasty, but in real life he probably does. But in a movie, of course, they don't have to worry about that. How fired up were you at the end of the movie for the sequel as he turns over and reveals the Joker card?
I was pretty goddamn excited. And in my theater at the time, because I remember this actually came out on a Wednesday, and I think I was like in my second to last week of school at the time, so I went after school, and like there wasn't as many people, but the people that were there were kind of like the diehards, and they all just kind of went, and then we're like, Joker, and then I was like, oh my God, like, whoa, okay, yeah, let's do this. But and then in my head I was like, maybe this is kind of like sort of a nod to like this is like the beginning before the Batman '89, and then I realized, no, this is a new universe, so we're getting like a Joker coming. And I was excited, man. And I didn't know when the sequel was coming, but I knew that, like, okay, I'm in, because this was probably the best, at the time, one of the best superhero movies ever made. You know, like, probably top 2 at that time when it came out.
Right. I was so fired up, man. Like, I was so ready for a sequel by the end of this. And it's very similar to how I feel about Marvel movies. And I don't know, I cannot recall a superhero movie previous to this one where they were so clearly confident enough that a sequel would happen. So I think Christopher Nolan, man, he really doesn't get the credit he deserves in a lot of ways. And I think this movie, even though it is seen as being lesser to The Dark Knight, I definitely don't see that. I see this as the start of a tremendous trilogy. And I'm gonna be a Dark Knight Rises apologist in 2 weeks. I'm just gonna let you know that right now, Brian, because there are a lot of people who think The Dark Knight Rises is bad, and I'm gonna be defending that movie throughout our podcast in 2 weeks.
I'll be defending it as well, but certain aspects of it don't necessarily add up chronologically, and that's kind of one of the weaknesses of that movie. But if you can let go of that, a lot of it is still effective. Especially, I think my favorite scene we'll talk about is actually just them talking, just Michael Caine and Christian Bale talking in the hallway.
Well, that's going to be an interesting episode, but next week, The Dark Knight Rises will be going into the superhero pantheon. If it doesn't, I quit. I will not be returning to this podcast if it doesn't. So for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.
Hey, do you know how to drive stick?